The letter was not supposed to exist. It arrived in a small European town in 2019, slipped quietly into a mailbox that hadn't changed locations for over a century. The envelope was yellowed, the ink faded, the paper fragile enough to tear at a touch. What made people stop breathing wasn't its condition, it was the date. Stamped clearly on the corner was a postmark from 1919, exactly 100 years earlier. And written on the front, in careful cursive handwriting, was the full name of a man who had officially died in World War I, buried in an unmarked grave, declared lost forever. Yet the letter had just arrived. Postal workers initially assumed it was a prank, but when they examined the envelope, every detail contradicted that assumption. The ink composition matched early 20th century formulas. The paper fibers were consistent with materials used before modern processing. Even the stamp was authentic, one that hadn't been printed since the war years. More disturbing was the address. The house still stood. The family name was still on the door. And inside lived the great-granddaughter of the man who sent it. She opened the letter believing it was a curiosity, something meant for a museum. Instead, she read words that froze her blood. "If you are reading this, then I did not return, but know this, I tried." The message was short, personal, written as if the sender knew, with certainty, that the letter would not arrive in his lifetime. He described the mud, the cold, the sound of artillery shaking the earth day and night. He spoke of fear, not of death, but of being forgotten. Then came the sentence that made historians question everything. "They told us the mail would be held until the war ends. But the war inside this place never does." Records confirmed the sender's identity. He was a frontline soldier reported missing during the final months of the war. His body was never recovered. His belongings were listed as destroyed, including all correspondence. So how did the letter survive, and why did it arrive exactly 100 years later? As news spread, archivists dug through forgotten postal records. They found references to a temporary military mail holding system, a wartime measure meant to delay letters from the front to prevent panic at home. Most of those facilities were destroyed. Some were sealed. One entry, marked simply Storage Site K, listed thousands of undelivered letters. No record of what happened to them afterward. No confirmation they were ever released. Only one thing was certain. The soldier who wrote the letter believed he would die, and he believed someone, someday, would read his words. What he could not have known was that his message would outlive empires, governments, even the memory of the war itself, arriving not as history, but as a voice from the grave. And this was only the beginning of what the letter revealed. When news of the century-late letter reached National Archives, attention turned away from the family and toward the postal system itself. Because for a message to arrive after 100 years, it did not need a miracle. It needed a place to be hidden. During World War I, military censorship reached levels the public never fully understood. Letters from soldiers were not just read, they were stored, delayed, and sometimes buried. Governments feared panic more than grief. A letter describing starvation, mutiny, or despair could destabilize an entire home front. So special holding facilities were created. They were not post offices, they were vaults. One such site, referred to only as Storage Site K, appeared briefly in a declassified ledger dated 1921. No address, no blueprint, just a notation, mail retained pending stabilization. Historians believe Site K was located near a railway junction used to transport wounded soldiers and classified material. Its purpose was simple: hold letters until the war ended, then release them. But the war did not end cleanly. Borders collapsed, governments fell, files vanished, and somewhere in the chaos, The vault was forgotten until renovation workers, nearly a century later, uncovered a sealed chamber beneath an old administrative building scheduled for demolition. Inside were wooden crates, hundreds of them, marked only with dates and military unit codes. The letters inside were never opened, never delivered. They contained confessions, last words, apologies, and fears written by men who believed their families would hear from them. Most of the envelopes were too fragile to survive exposure. Archivists began the slow, painful process of cataloging what remained. The vast majority were deemed undeliverable, the recipients long dead, addresses erased by time. But a few names still existed. One of those names matched the letter that had arrived in 2019. Postal records revealed the truth. The letter was never lost. It was delayed by design. When the vault was rediscovered, officials faced a dilemma. Delivering the letters would reopen wounds that history had sealed. Families had mourned without words. Nations had rewritten memory. So most of the letters were transferred to archives, quietly. Only a handful were released, cases where families could be traced, and consent was obtained. But even then, something strange happened. Several letters reached homes that had never requested them, as if the mail itself had resumed a journey interrupted a century earlier. Officials denied responsibility. They claimed automated sorting errors, yet the timing was precise, and the emotional impact devastating, because for the families, the past was no longer past. The war had spoken again, and it had waited patiently. The man who wrote the letter was not famous. He was not an officer. He did not receive medals. His name never appeared in history books, and that was exactly what haunted him. According to military records, he was a 23-year-old infantryman drafted in the final year of the war, a factory worker before enlistment. He had never left his hometown before being shipped to the front. His letters, those that survived, shared a common tone. Not fear of dying, fear of disappearing. In one earlier letter, recovered from the vault but never delivered, he wrote, "If I fall here, there will be no story." Just a line on a paper that no one reads. He had witnessed men vanish into shell craters, swallowed by mud, erased by artillery. No body, no grave, no explanation, just absence. The army classified many such soldiers as missing, not dead. Families waited years for confirmation. Some never received it. He knew this, and so he wrote differently. His final letter, the one delivered a century later, was not meant to inform. It was meant to exist. He described small details instead of battles: the smell of wet wool, the sound of boots pulling free from mud, the way the sky glowed orange at night. He wrote about home as if describing it to himself, afraid the memory would fade. Most chilling was his certainty. He did not ask to be remembered. He assumed he would not be. "If this letter waits longer than me," he wrote, "then at least my words will have lived." Historians believe he was killed during a chaotic night assault in the final weeks of the war. The unit suffered heavy losses. Bodies were never recovered. His name was later engraved on a memorial under the category "Missing Presumed Dead." That should have been the end, but the letter refused to stay buried. Psychologists who studied similar delayed correspondence say such messages have a powerful effect. Because they collapse time, they turn history into something personal, immediate, uncomfortable. For the great-granddaughter who read his words, he was no longer a name on stone. He was a voice, a young man who knew he would vanish and tried, desperately, to leave something behind. And the most unsettling question remained. Did he somehow know the letter would arrive long after everyone who remembered him was gone? Or was the delay itself the final cruelty of war? At first, officials treated the century-late letter as a historical anomaly, a what-if mistake. a bureaucratic accident, an emotional coincidence. But as archivists continued reviewing the contents of the rediscovered vault, a pattern began to emerge, one that made many of them deeply uncomfortable. This was not the only letter written with future certainty. Several messages inside the crates contained language that suggested the writers did not expect their words to arrive soon or at all. Some even wrote as if addressing people who had not yet been born. One soldier ended his letter with, "If my mother is gone by the time this reaches home, let whoever reads this know I thought of her at the end." Another wrote, "If this is ever read, then the war has ended. That alone will be enough." These were not hopeful delays. They were anticipations of absence. Historians began to wonder whether soldiers had been told, directly or indirectly, that mail might never be delivered. Some military units reportedly warned troops not to describe frontline realities, implying their letters would be withheld indefinitely. In effect, soldiers were writing into a void, and many seemed to know it. What disturbed researchers most was the timing alignment. The letters that survived best, those still legible enough to be delivered, were often dated just days or weeks before their authors were killed or listed as missing. It was as if final letters were being written with unusual clarity, almost like wills. When questioned, military historians pointed to psychological factors. Men facing death often develop heightened awareness, they said, a sharpened sense of finality. But that explanation did not fully satisfy those handling the documents, because some letters referenced events that happened after they were written. One message mentioned the fall of a nearby town that officially occurred 3 days later. Another referred to a unit's destruction that, according to records, had not yet taken place. These discrepancies were small but real. Critics argued records could be wrong, dates misfiled, memories altered, yet the accumulation of inconsistencies made denial harder. The postal vault was no longer just a storage site. It was evidence of a system that suspended human communication during war, turning letters into artifacts rather than messages. And once suspended, time itself lost meaning. Officials quietly limited further research. Access to the vault's full contents was restricted. Requests for publication approval stalled. The story, they decided, was becoming too complicated, too emotional, too dangerous. Because if people began to believe that war not only killed bodies but interrupted time, then remembrance itself would become unstable, and that was a question no institution wanted to answer. For the family, history had always been quiet. There were no stories passed down about the soldier, no diaries, no treasured letters preserved in boxes, just a name on a memorial wall and a faded photograph stored in a drawer, brought out only on rare occasions. He had been spoken of carefully, as someone who never came back, that was all. So when the letter arrived, it didn't feel like discovering history. It felt like being interrupted by it. The great-granddaughter read the letter alone first. She later said, "The most unsettling part was not the sadness, it was the familiarity. The way he described home matched stories she had heard growing up, streets that still existed, habits that had survived generations." He wrote about waiting for church bells that never rang, about dreaming of a kitchen table that had been passed down and still stood in the house. Things he should not have known would survive him. The family gathered that evening. They read the letter aloud, and in that moment, the war stopped being distant. It entered the room. Psychologists note that delayed grief can be more powerful than immediate loss. The family had mourned a shadow. Now they were meeting the person. There were questions with no answers. Why had the letter come now? Who decided it should finally be delivered? What else had been held back? As media interest grew, the family was offered compensation, Museum requests followed. Interviews were proposed. They declined most of them because the letter didn't feel like an artifact. It felt like a conversation resumed after being cruelly paused. What unsettled them most was the final line. If this reaches you late, forgive the silence. Forgive whom? The soldier, the system, history itself. The family requested access to the vault to see if more letters existed. They were denied. Officials cited preservation concerns, but the family understood the real reason. Some messages are too personal to release because they don't belong to the past. They belong to the present, and once spoken, they change everything. The truth was never officially announced. It didn't need to be. Behind closed doors, archivists, historians, and government officials reached a quiet consensus. Most of the letters would never leave the archives, not because they were unimportant, but because they were too powerful. Each letter represented a moment frozen in fear, hope, and uncertainty. Delivering them would not simply add footnotes to history, it would reopen emotional wounds that families had sealed generations ago. And more dangerously, they would expose how deliberately human voices were silenced during wartime. Internal discussions revealed uncomfortable realities. Many letters had been withheld not for security but for narrative control. Soldiers wrote about starvation, disobedience, collapsing morale, and doubt. Messages that contradicted patriotic messaging of the time. To release them now would force institutions to admit that public memory of the war had been curated, that sacrifice had been shaped into something more acceptable. Some officials argued that families deserved the truth, no matter how late. Others warned that releasing thousands of such letters would cause emotional chaos, legal claims, and moral outrage. Governments would be asked questions they could never answer cleanly. Why were these letters hidden? Who decided silence was better than grief? And how many lives were emotionally erased along with the words? So a policy was formed quietly. Only letters that could be traced to living relatives who requested them would be considered for delivery. Even then, families would receive warnings. Psychological counseling was suggested. Consent forms were required. And still, most requests were denied. The archives became a kind of second graveyard. Rows of shelves holding final thoughts that would never be heard. One archivist, speaking anonymously years later, said, "We are not preserving history. We are containing it." What made the decision even harder was this realization. The letters did not lose their power. With time, they gained it. A letter written in 1918 carried the rawness of a moment before. Death untainted by interpretation, politics, or hindsight. It spoke directly across generations. And that made it dangerous, because once people hear the unfiltered voices of the past, they stop accepting simplified versions of history. They start asking why. And war does not survive why. Very well, so the letters remain locked away, not because they are forgotten, but because they are remembered too clearly. Long after the media attention faded, the archives remained restless, not physically but morally. Those who worked closest to the letters carried a question they never wrote down, never spoke aloud in meetings, but thought about constantly. Who decided when a voice from the past was allowed to speak? Because somewhere between the trenches of World War I and the mailbox of 2019, authority over memory had been claimed. Archivists noticed something disturbing. The letters that survived best, the ones still legible, still deliverable, were often from soldiers who expressed doubt, fear, or disillusionment. Their words challenged the clean narrative of noble sacrifice. It was as if truth itself had been placed on hold. One senior archivist admitted privately, if these letters had been delivered on time, the war might not have lasted as long. That single thought changed everything. because it suggested the silence was not accidental, it was strategic. The archives were no longer neutral spaces of preservation. They were active participants in shaping historical understanding, deciding which emotions were acceptable, which memories were too dangerous. Researchers who attempted to study the psychological impact of withheld wartime correspondence faced unusual resistance. Funding requests were denied, access limited, peer review stalled. Not censorship, just friction, enough to slow progress until interest died. And yet, the question refused to disappear. If one letter could survive a century and still shatter a family's sense of time, what would thousands do? What would happen if entire generations heard the unfiltered voices of the dead? Perhaps the real fear was not grief. It was accountability. Because these letters did not ask for revenge. They asked for honesty. And honesty destabilizes carefully constructed history. The archivists understood now why the soldier had written the way he did, why he spoke to a future he would never see, why he accepted that silence might outlive him. He was not just writing to family. He was writing to time itself, and time eventually answered. But not fully, not yet. The question remained locked inside the archives, echoing between shelves of unopened words. How many truths are still waiting for permission to arrive? In the end, the letter was not the message. It was the proof. Proof that time does not erase truth, it only delays it. Proof that voices silenced by war do not disappear. They wait. The soldier never asked for recognition. He did not demand justice. He did not accuse anyone by name. He did something far more dangerous. He remembered, and in remembering, he challenged the idea that history belongs to the living alone. The real message from the grave was this: silence is a decision. Someone chose to delay that letter. Someone chose to store it. Someone chose when it was finally allowed to arrive. And those choices shaped not just one family's history, but everyone's understanding of the war. We often believe the past is fixed. It isn't. It is edited, archived, filtered, sometimes mailed late. The letter's arrival, after 100 years, exposed an uncomfortable truth: that history is not only written by victors, but managed by gatekeepers, and they decide when the dead are allowed to speak. Somewhere in a vault, thousands of voices still wait. Final thoughts never heard. Last words never answered. Love letters with no recipients. Confessions without forgiveness, not lost, just delayed. And perhaps one day, another letter will arrive, unexpected, unwanted, undeniable, reminding us that time does not forgive silence, it remembers it.
fire and shrapnel multiple times. And because they were worried that the attacking forces would come back to scavenge the contractors for equipment,